all professions, those who are just beginning need educating in the intellectual life ahead of them. And those who are practitioners need not only to know where to find the resources of their profession, but ideally also to be exposed to continuing education. This is partly because the world around us changes so much. The topics falling within international law develop at an astonishing rate. New institutions, treaties, judgments, awards appear continuously and relentlessly. And this is where we turn to this great resource that you're going to see this afternoon, the United Nations Audiovisual Library of International Law, the AVL. In the historic archives, the user can enrich the reading of a text of a treaty by listening to statements of the drafters, viewing images of the negotiations, learning about the historical context, assessing key preparatory documents, and examining carefully selected jurisprudence and doctrine. He or she can then delve deeper into the topic by using the research library, which collects and organizes resources on treaties, jurisprudence, and scholarly writings. The most striking innovation is the lecture series, which brings together international law scholars and practitioners from around the world to lecture on dozens of topics, from the Arctic to the United Nations. And unlike many online legal resources, all of this is offered for free. The AVL is not just for those immersed in the practice of law, domestic or international, but also for all citizens who are trying to understand something about the UN, the family of nations, or individual rights.
The United Nations rose like the legendary phoenix from the ashes of the Second World War. It is a tribute to the indomitable spirit of human beings who continue to believe that the world can and must be a better place, even in the wake of war, injustice, human suffering, and tragedy. In the final days of the Second World War, 50 nations came together to form an international organization to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, and to establish conditions under which justice and respect for international law could be maintained. It is not for us to judge the extent to which the United Nations has accomplished these goals over the past 65 years, but rather to share with you our vision for bringing the world ever closer to achieving them. In our view, international law is the essential foundation for building a world in which peace, justice, and the rule of law prevail. For the first time in its history, the United Nations has the capacity to create such a foundation by making international law accessible to all peoples and nations of the world. The United Nations Audiovisual Library of International Law. The AVL is the first virtual international law training and research center in the history of the United Nations, which brings together over 200 leading international law scholars and practitioners from countries around the world. The AVL consists of 3 pillars: the Historic Archives, the Lecture Series, and the Research Library. The Historic Archives contains introductory notes by leading experts and audiovisual recordings relating to significant legal instruments which constitute some of the greatest achievements in the history of the United Nations. The Historic Archives preserves the audiovisual heritage of the United Nations in the progressive development and codification of international law, and promotes a better understanding of the essential role of the United Nations in the advancement of the rule of law around the world.
There were many who doubted that agreement could ever be reached by these 50 countries, differing so much in race and religion, in language and culture. But these differences were all forgotten in one unshakable unity of determination to find a way to end wars.
I believe the present Declaration of Human Rights is a document of the first order of importance. While history alone can determine the historic significance of an event, it is safe to say that the declaration before us may be destined to occupy an honorable place in the procession of positive landmarks in human history.
This convention can become an important and beneficial element in the development of international law and of the international community. And I say can become because whether it will do so depends, in our opinion, to a major degree upon one controlling condition, and that is that we can achieve impartial trial and adequate punishment of persons guilty of genocide, whatever their nationality, their status, or their rank.
But to us in Asia and Africa, who have experienced colonial domination in the past and are even now seeing the true picture of colonialism with grim consequences to the people under its yoke, this is a matter which should not be treated lightly and must not be allowed to be given the Cold War treatment in this debate. To us, it is something which is vital to the evolution of a new world order based on freedom, justice, and equality for all men, irrespective of their color or the region to which they belong. In our opinion, this is the kind of world order which is envisaged in the Charter of the United Nations itself.
Universal respect for human rights is inseparable from world peace. We do recognize that peace itself is indeed the supreme right of all. We should therefore recognize that at the root of all strife and tyranny, in the present as in the past, lies a violation of human rights in one form or another.
the reality can no longer be ignored that we live in an interdependent world which is bound together to a common destiny. The very response of the international community to the challenge of apartheid confirmed this very point that we all understood, that as long as apartheid existed in South Africa, so long would the whole of humanity feel demeaned and degraded. The United Nations understood this very well, that racism in our country could not but feed racism in other parts of the world as well. The universal struggle against apartheid was therefore not an act of charity arising out of pity for our people, but an affirmation of our common humanity.
This conference is destined to be one of the most important in the history of the United Nations, and I might say, without running the risk of extravagance, in the history of international relations. As regards the number of states participating in it, it may well be the largest conference ever held. Its agenda encompasses a range of subjects and issues which are of vital concern, both politically and economically, to the entire world. In its scope, it embraces problems of a political, economic, ecological, and technological character, and its successful conclusion would have a lasting impact on the future of mankind.
The issue at stake here is the need to punish collectively the acts of crime against humanity and not the geographical location or the political complexion of the alleged criminals. Therefore, Nigeria welcomes the fact that the Security Council is able this afternoon to approve the resolution and its annexed statute establishing an international tribunal for the sole purpose of prosecuting persons responsible for acts of genocide and other serious violations of international humanitarian law committed in this case on the territory of Rwanda in the aftermath of the events of April 6, 1994.
The establishment of the ICC is above all a triumph of the universal value of justice, which is shared by all peoples of the world.
The lecture series contains a permanent collection of lectures of enduring value on virtually every subject of international law by leading international law scholars and practitioners from different countries, legal systems, cultures, and sectors of the legal profession. The AVL will preserve for all time the enduring legacy of these great scholars and practitioners who have had such a profound influence on the development of international law theory and practice in our lifetime.
International law has some very special features. It was shaped on the grounds of the will and of the necessities of the society it had to regulate. International law and the modern states are contemporary, and it's because of states that international law was born. It was shaped by states in order to have a common language of communication. International law is thus the product of states, and because they created it, it is much more important to follow its evolution when following the evolution of the International Society of States.
Today is probably the time when international courts and tribunals have been at their busiest. There has never been a time in the history of international relations when a state was more likely to find that a dispute in which it was involved, whether with another state or with a private party, an individual or a corporation, was going to be taken to court. Today, international courts and the processes that they apply are an essential and central part of the fabric of how states do business.
Territorial disputes are international disputes, but have a particular resonance in view of the critical centrality of territory to both the creation and continuity of statehood. Territorial disputes often concern important economic resources, such as oil, minerals, or water, while over and above all such factors, the political and psychological attachment to land, typical of all nations, ensures that any territorial issue between states will necessarily be high profile. In addition, the attribution of territory will determine such critical questions as nationality and the exercise of jurisdiction over legal and natural persons.
Today we see state sovereignty not as an absolute good in itself, but as an instrument, albeit a very important one, which has value only insofar as it is used to protect human life, to ensure respect for human dignity, and to uphold human rights. Sovereignty, in other words, should be seen not as a privilege, but as a very heavy responsibility. Only when it is exercised in that right, in that spirit, with due respect to fundamental human rights and the dignity and worth of human person, as proclaimed in the Charter of the United Nations, will sovereignty be recognized by all as credible and legitimate.
I regard the right of individual petitioner at international level one of the greatest achievements of international legal thinking, because it restored the human person to the central place that belongs to her in the international legal order. It is the most precious legacy of international legal doctrine from the middle of the 20th century until our days.
It's often important to see an international instrument in its historical context. The Universal Declaration responded to the Second World War. The African Charter responded to the history of colonialism, to slavery, to the way in which Africa has been really affected by developments around the world, and also the African values itself. So in that way, also the African Charter is a product of its time, a product of the culture within which it was developed.
Diplomatic protection must be seen as a mechanism for the protection of human rights. It's one of the weapons, so to speak, of international law that may be employed to protect human rights. But it only applies in respect of nationals of the state that seeks to protect the injured person.
The African Union is the latest institutional manifestation of a long-standing quest for economic and political unity in Africa. It constitutes the present-day concretization, one could say, of the Pan-Africanist ideals dedicated to the economic, social, and cultural advancement of the peoples of Africa.
I think the decision to establish the Commission on International Law for the African Union was a noble one because there are many pertinent issues of international law within the African continent that the African Union Commission on International Law stands a very good chance to address them. And I think it will also help so much to develop international law in Africa, to promote the respect for international law in Africa, to promote the appreciation that there are international law standards which govern many aspects of daily lives within the African continent, be it economic issues, political issues, governance issues, and even social issues.
The Research Library provides an extensive online international law library with links to treaties, judicial decisions, United Nations publications, and scholarly writings by prominent international lawyers, including AVL faculty members. Every individual in every country of the world is welcome to visit the AVL free of charge via the internet.